Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Veg Grower Podcast. My name's Richard and I want to encourage and inspire you to grow more of your own food in whatever space you have available. And I do this by sharing exactly what I've been doing in my own allotment, my own kitchen garden here in Littlehampton on the south coast of the UK. Now, coming up this week, I have got an update from the allotment where we have been having a bit of a problem with Stormy coming through. We have also got the seed of the month from the potting shed, and back in the potting shed I'm going to talk to you about some of my plans for 2026. So without much ado, let's get into it, shall we? Well, I'm in the greenhouse here on the allotment, in Grandad's greenhouse as I call it, and I'm in here because I'm just sheltering out of the wind. Now, the wind at the moment is pretty high. We've had a storm come through this weekend, Stormy, I believe it has been called, and that has caused a few issues, of course. One of the things that worried me whenever we get a storm come through is just how much damage I'm going to get on the allotment or in the kitchen garden. Well, the kitchen garden was okay, so it's not until I get on the allotment that I really know if we've got any damage. And in the past, we've had really quite a bit of damage, greenhouses broken, sheds turned over. We've even had a tornado come through last year alone. So whenever there's a storm, I'm always on quite high alert. When I came down to the allotment, I'm pleased to say that we suffered no damages, no loss, nothing to really worry about, apart from maybe a few apples or pears blown off the trees, but that's not the end of the world. So overall, really happy that we didn't get any damage on the allotment. The biggest trouble, of course, was trying to find something to do. It's still quite windy outside and it can be quite dangerous when you're trying to work in the wind. So luckily I have the greenhouse, and I do have quite a few things I needed to get done inside the greenhouse. For me, the greenhouse, the crops in here, particularly the tomatoes, they're coming to the end of their life. They're not going to produce anymore. They're looking tired, so it was time to really tidy those away, clear away all those spent crops, get them in the compost bin. And that was just a start. What I realised once I cleared all those away and had a good tidy up in the greenhouse, realised that I actually have quite a good space in here for growing some of our winter crops. This could be things like winter lettuce and so on. But one of the things I've got to remember is, and I think it's often overlooked, a greenhouse is of course here for extending the seasons. It's somewhere in the winter to grow crops, get our young plants started a little bit earlier, give them a bit of protection. But what I wanted to do this year is grow more crops inside the greenhouse over winter. Things like winter lettuce and cress and so on. So what's often overlooked is the state of the glass. Glass throughout the year can get quite dirty. And when it gets dirty, it doesn't let light through. So I was very keen to give the glass a good clean, both inside and out. Now this is fairly easy. I like to use just a good stiff brush and water and just give it a good wash both inside and out, clearing away any bits of rubbish, clearing away getting into any nooks and crannies, and really do give it a good clean up. Now I tend to just use water, as I've already said. In the past I may have used an environmentally friendly dish soap, but on a whole I don't like to use any chemicals. I try to keep it as natural as possible. There are of course greenhouse cleaners, greenhouse soaps that we could use. They're not for me. They're just not for me. Not just because of the price, but because I like to keep things natural. I grow food in here. I grow food on outside the greenhouse. I like to keep them natural. So anyway, the greenhouse has had a good tidy up, and I think it looks all the better for it. That left me with a few things to try and do outside, which again falls very much into that sort of autumn tidy up period that we are going through, clearing away any weeds and composting those. I would like to cut the grass, but I think the lawnmower is going to struggle because the grass is so wet and so long. So I'm going to hold off for that. I'm going to have to hit that with a strimmer, but that's a job for another time. One of the things that I do find that as gardeners we tend to do, however, is that when we give ourselves the autumn tidy up, we try to be too tidy. And this means that we clear away anything that looks bad, anything that's gone past its best. And that means that nature, the wildlife, doesn't have anywhere to hibernate. Those little stems of hollow, whatever it may be, I'm looking at my globe artichokes that are very brown as a good example. They can harbour things like ladybird larvae and things like that that need to hibernate over winter. So sometimes it just pays to not be too tidy, especially if you garden like me where you do encourage wildlife. However, if you do want to be tidy, it is always worth just putting up some bug hotels and giving nature somewhere to live, just to help you in the spring, just to help with pest control and pollination and a wide range of reasons. Nature is your friend here. Nature is your friend. Now, talking of nature, however, I have noticed one of the big problems I've had this year has been with the cabbage white butterflies. And as I was wandering around, I noticed that on my winter cabbages that I'm getting quite a few more caterpillars, even at this time of year. Now, I think the cabbages are strong enough to survive the caterpillars, so I'm not overly worried. But it's something, again, we have to look and take action by simply removing the caterpillars and reducing their numbers. They'll be fine because they will go to feed the chickens, as I always like to do. But it's surprising how late these cabbage white butterflies, for me, are still going on. Here we are, at the beginning of October. It's certainly much more chilly, but the cabbage white butterfly, or the cabbage white caterpillars, are still there. It just goes to show we got to keep on top of everything that we are doing. So it has been a bit of a quiet weekend due to the weather, but nevertheless, it's the joys of having an allotment. I'm going to head on home now, but in the meantime, let's find out what's been going on in the Supporters Club this week, and I will meet you back in my potting shed for the seed of the month. But it's that point of the podcast where every week I ask you if you would be good enough to leave a rating and review on your podcast provider. It only takes you a few seconds, but it means the world to us. Just want to say hello to everybody on Podbean. We seemed to disappear off there for a while, but we seem to be back on Podbean. Now, not only that, if you're enjoying this podcast, you want to help support the work that we do, then please also consider becoming a member of the Veg Grower Podcast Supporters Club. The Supporters Club is set up to help keep this podcast running, help keep the wheels turning. For just £5 a month, you get access to extra behind the scenes podcasts that give you more of an idea what's going on here at the Veg Grower Podcast HQ. But not only that, once a month you will also receive our monthly seed pack, and in that seed pack you will receive several packets of seeds that can be sown in that very month. But added to that, you also get a copy of our monthly newspaper that gives you a bit of an idea what to do that month and a few instructions on how to sow those seeds that are included in the seed pack. And that is all for just £5 a month. Now, over this last week, we haven't actually sown any of these seeds because they have all gone out in the post. But we have been going over all the tasks that we could be doing throughout October, as well as the seeds that are being received in that month. Now, if that sounds like something you would be interested in, then please do head to the veggrowerpodcast.co.uk to sign up and keep this podcast running. Right, back to the gardening. Well, I'm back home and in my potting shed now, and I'm in here because I'm sowing some overwintering varieties of broad beans. I've got two varieties that I'm sowing, Aqua Dolce Claudia and the Sutton. Now, I tend to sow these throughout October and November. I like to spread them out just to try and extend the harvests and make sure that we get these growing throughout the winter as well. Now, but I'm on a hard clay soil here, but because I've added plenty of organic matter in most of my beds, I could actually sow these directly in the soil, about 2.5 centimetres deep. But I'm actually sowing mine in root trainers of multi-purpose compost to get them started inside, and once I feel they are strong enough to go outside, which will probably be a month's time, I'll start hardening them off and then get them into the soil. Now that is all we really have to do to get these broad beans started and growing. They're incredibly easy to look after. They don't need much care, especially over winter. Generally speaking, the soil stays moist all winter, so we don't need to water them. We just need to keep them weed free as much as possible. Good mulch, of course, will help with that as well. One of the other things that we do need to consider, however, is that if it does get incredibly cold, we may have to cover over our broad beans with a fleece. Now, where I am on the south coast of the UK, I've never had to do that, but we've never really experienced a really cold winter here. But in colder parts of the country, or wherever you may be, it may be worth just keeping an eye on the weather. If you do see some below freezing temperatures, keep that fleece handy and throw over your broad beans. I think many of us are going to keep those fleeces handy throughout the winter anyway, just in case, because many of our plants will benefit from it. Now, all we're going to do as they grow throughout the winter, they will be pretty slow growing, but as we get into spring, you'll suddenly see them spring back into life and start to grow stronger and stronger. And fairly soon, we would then end up with broad beans. Now, I often find that these broad beans are producing earlier than any broad beans that we sow in the spring. I actually don't sow any broad beans in the spring. I tend to just stick with autumn sown broad beans, overwintered, because I find that that is good enough for me. One of the other big advantages that I find with growing overwintered broad beans is that we tend to get less black fly when compared to spring sown broad beans. So for me, that's a really big advantage. Black fly, of course, being an aphid, they can suck out the sap of our broad beans and end up with poorer quality broad beans. But as I say, by using overwintered broad beans, nasturtiums as a companion plant as well to take away any black fly that we may get, we tend to get very few problems. In fact, broad beans on a whole, we tend to get very few problems with anyway. Now, one of the things is when we harvest our broad beans, we wait until they're fairly tender. If we let them get too big, I think they can tend to taste a little bit dry. I like to pick them when they are young and tender. We take them out the pods and we use those. Now, the pods themselves are actually edible as well. I've used those in cooking quite a few times in the past. Dipping them in a bit of batter and frying them works quite nicely. It's a bit interesting flavour, but not everyone's cup of tea, but I personally quite like it. Then once our broad beans are finished with, I then cut off the stem at the ground level, leaving the roots in the ground. Broad beans are a bit of a legume, so they probably will fix nitrogen into the soil. And I hesitate a bit when I'm saying that because we are trying to encourage them to produce broad beans. And you often find that when we encourage them to produce food, there is less nitrogen in the roots that they fix into the soil because they tend to use that nitrogen in the broad bean process. But nonetheless, it's still a good way of improving the soil and benefiting crops that might follow on. Now, of course, in the blog post, you will find a link with our affiliate code to Premier Seeds Direct and the broad beans they sell on there. Please do go and look it up and possibly buy some of these if you are going to give it a try. It is an affiliate code, so it gives me a little bit of commission when you buy from them. Not my preferred way. I'd sooner give you discount codes, but I can't seem to be able to get that anymore for you guys. There's still time in the future. If we can use it more, we could end up with discount codes. So please do go use my affiliate code. Now, moving on from that, what else has been happening? The big thing that I've been doing here this weekend is, as you may recall, a couple of weeks ago, I got 2 new chickens. And that meant that they have spent the last 2 weeks separated from my original flock, just getting used to each other. Well, this weekend, I decided that they were going to go together. Now, I expected a bit of fighting, and that did happen. One of our older chickens in particular was being quite brutal with the smaller two, and this is why I was on hand to break up any fights that happened. Luckily, the smaller two do tend to stay away from the older three at the moment because they're still getting their pecking order established. But overall, it hasn't been too difficult. They are kind of used to each other. They've just got to figure out the pecking order to find out who's in charge, who's the boss. It happens with chickens. It happens with a lot of animals, and it's part of the joys of keeping chickens. However, we're still getting 2 eggs a day at the moment. I reckon the other chicken's probably going to start laying in the next few weeks. Outside, as I said, it's been very windy, which made things going on in the garden a little bit tricky. But it's still full of so much food. I really cannot believe just how full my beds are at this time of year. Normally at this time of year, I'd be expecting things to start looking their worst and we're having to remove things because they've dying from being too much cold. It's not happening so much here in the Veg Grower Podcast kitchen garden. They're still holding on. That's not saying that they're going to hold on forever, but for now, a lot of our plants are still holding on. However, if I do feel that they're not going to produce anymore, that is the time to remove them, cut them down and compost them. Compost, of course, being a big thing that we need to build a lot of. So really we want to be collecting the plants when they're still green, when they've still got a bit of growth about them. If we leave them to go brown and dead, they've lost a lot of that nutrition for the compost. So really we want to cut them when I feel they're not going to produce anymore. In the case of tomatoes and things like that, I think if this weather continues to drop, we're going to be a few weeks away from that. So close eye on the weather, of course. I'm sure many of you, wherever you may be, you're probably already finding that your tomatoes are not producing. So you've probably already made that decision. Right, well, I think it is now time that I head to the podding shed so that I can share with you some of my plans for the 2026 season. In the meantime, let's find out what the recipe of the week is.
Chopping all the veggies, sizzle in the air. Chef's got with the magic, smells are everywhere. Water starts to boil, onions hit the pan. Recipe of the week, let the feast begin. Cooking with Chef Scott, flavors come alive. Tune in every week for a tasty bite.
Well, unfortunately, Chef Scott's not here this week. I think you'll probably hear him in a few weeks' time. But I do have a recipe for you, and because the seed of the month this week is broad bean, I wanted to time it in to have a broad bean recipe. And the good thing is this recipe does actually use fresh or frozen broad beans. So what have I got for you? It's a broad bean and mint hummus. Now this is a slightly unusual dish, but it's one that I actually make quite often. It's one that I thoroughly enjoy. Best of all, it is really easy. Now it's unlikely that you're going to have fresh broad beans from the garden available, but if you're like me, you might have loads in the freezer that are taking up space and you're thinking of how to use them. So what you need is 300 grams of broad beans, either fresh or frozen, 1 small clove of garlic, 2 tablespoons of tahini paste, the juice of half a lemon, a small handful of fresh mint leaves, and 2 tablespoons of olive oil and a bit of salt and pepper to taste. Now to make this, you start by boiling the broad beans for a few minutes until they're nice and tender. Then you drain them and pop them out their skins if they are large. This just makes the hummus a little bit smoother and easier to digest, in my opinion. Then you take those broad beans, you add them to a food processor along with the garlic, the tahini paste, the lemon juice, the mint and a drizzle of the olive oil, and you blitz it all together until smooth, adding a splash of water or a bit more oil if it is needed to get the right texture, and then you just use the salt and pepper to season to taste. That is it. That is your broad bean and mint hummus made. Serve it quite simply as a dip with some flatbreads or spread it on toast. Absolutely delicious, especially with a poached egg. Really nice little lunch there, I've got to say. So absolutely delicious. Give it a go and let me know how you get on. Well, of course, you can find that recipe on the veggrowerpodcast.co.uk if you do want it written down so that you can follow along when you give it a try. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I suggested to you that you sit down and draw out your allotment, your kitchen garden, so that we can start making plans of things that we're going to do in 2026. And I did that very same thing at the time. But now, with it being a wet, windy weekend, I've spent a lot of time making a few plans of what I want to achieve in 2026. Here we are, beginning of October, towards the end of 2025. I've always said that this feels like the beginning of the gardening year. Our garlic and our onions are going in and things like that. I feel that this is the beginning of the gardening year. And like so many things in life, I do believe that it all starts with having a plan. Now, I sat down this weekend trying to avoid this cold weather, this windy weather, just making plans of what I want to achieve in 2026. And it fell down into quite a few distinct areas. I'll start with the kitchen garden. One of the key things that I want to do with the kitchen garden is just make it look a lot more appealing. Now, I've always said that a kitchen garden needs to look appealing. It needs to look attractive. It doesn't need to look like an allotment where everything's a bit ramshackled or anything like that. It needs to look like a garden. I take a lot of inspiration for some of the kitchen gardens that I visit up and down the country in stately homes and places like that. One of my real inspirations has actually been from Lucy Chamberlain's garden that I've seen on Instagram or in her book, of just how beautiful a kitchen garden can look. And that for me is where I want to be going. I really want to make the kitchen garden look attractive. It still needs to produce food, don't get me wrong, but I want it to look attractive enough that people would want to come and see it, maybe even opening for the NGAS, National Garden Scheme open days. It would be great to get ourselves to that sort of look. The trouble is, I've always treated my kitchen garden and my allotment for that matter to be a practical thing, in that they're there to produce food for the kitchen, not so much to look at. But I don't think that the two need to be exclusive. I think that we can make them look good as well as be productive. Now, this falls down in several areas. One of the things that I've recognised that my style of gardening is what I call snap gardening. This is my own definition. Snap gardening stands for simple, natural and productive. And I think that's what we've got to do. We've got to keep the kitchen garden simple. We've got to keep it natural and we've got to keep it productive. So that is my three tenets. How do we keep it simple? How do we keep it natural? How do we keep it productive? Well, for me, the way I'm going to keep it simple is by doing what is known as polyculture. And polyculture works by simply just having a mixed planting. So you might have a cabbage plant next to a tomato plant, for example. And the idea here is that we have this mixed planting. It works as a bit of a companion planting. But ultimately, the idea here is that we have a plant, it needs somewhere to go. We've got a space, that's where it goes. In the past, I've very much had my beds laid out so that I can do crop rotations. So my beans and peas would be in one bed, my roots such as garlic and onions and beetroot in another bed would be my brassicas, and then my final bed would be my mixed plants, where we would just plant anything that we had available. Well, what I want to do, these are of course my four main beds, is just take those four beds. We're going to fill them completely up with compost when space becomes available, but we're just going to put some plants in when we need them. An example of that would be the garlic that we've recently planted out in the kitchen garden. Normally all my garlic would go into the same bed, all running next to each other, but what I've done instead is I've taken my varieties of garlic and I've just made rows around the edge of every single bed with the garlic. Now you may be thinking that, well, why you've still got a row of garlic? Surely that doesn't go with the mixed planting. And this is where I've been having difficulties trying to work out what I'm going to do. I have stuck with rows of things like garlic because they're going to all be growing at the same time and harvested at the same time as well. So it's not going to be like a space comes available and we can fill it up. it's going to all grow together. So it's going to keep it that simple way of harvesting, but still sticking with this simple method of planting at the same time. Natural, of course, we're going to be encouraging more and more wildlife. This is something I always do, and we're going to be making more of an effort to encourage wildlife in with bird houses, bug hotels and hedgehog houses, things like that that just encourage wildlife in. Again, I think by having this polyculture technique as well, it's going to encourage the wildlife in, and this should hopefully reduce the amount of pests, reduce the amount of other issues going on, while still encouraging the wildlife in and giving wildlife a home. And I'm hoping that these two techniques together are going to lead us to having a productive garden. Fingers crossed that is going to happen. I think it will. Now, down on the allotment, we're sticking with this snap principle, but we're not going to necessarily do polyculture because I do have crop rotation going on down on the allotment, but my crop rotation is done in a way that enables me to, as a crop comes out, I can pot the next crop in. So it's a crop rotation done on harvesting times and to make it more suitable for getting the most out of that land. But we're not going to be doing polyculture at the moment down there. We're of course going to continue doing companion planting and things like that, but for now it is very much going to be about keeping it productive on the allotment, trying to produce as much food as we possibly can. I'm not so worried about how it looks to a certain degree, but I just want it to be a productive food place. Now, one of the key things I found this year with the allotment is that we have, of course, been doing straw bale gardening, which has been incredibly successful, growing a large amount of food in straw bales. It'd been really, really productive, and it's taken care of some areas that were a little bit tricky. So in some of our beds that haven't had any organic matter, we're going to do straw bale gardening. Now, in that same vein, I have been, of course, using straw as a mulch on some of my beds this year. Not all my beds, but a lot of my beds this year, we've used straw as a mulch. And it's been really, really successful. I've grown some of the best potatoes I've ever grown. I've reduced the amount of weeding that I've needed to do. It has really, really worked. And it's been a cheap mulch to produce. Now, I've always said that the best mulch is compost, but I can never produce enough compost on the allotment for it to work out. And I've got a few beds that are lacking on organic matter. So I'm hoping, and it's starting to pay off, that by using this straw as a mulch, we're not needing as much compost, but we're able to produce more and more compost by using this mulch. The two are working together quite nicely. Eventually it would be good to get to the point that we don't need to use straw. But I think for the next year, we're going to continue using straw until we've got enough compost that all our beds are filled up every single year. That is going to be the aim for next year as well, to try and produce enough compost, bigger compost bins that are filled up with more and more organic matter. And we can then try and see just how much we need to use straw throughout the following year. But the straw has really worked at reducing the amount of water lost through evaporation. I've spoken about it a lot, but it's really reduced the amount of watering that we've needed to do, but it's also reduced the amount of weeding that we need to do, which has meant that the allotment has been easier to maintain this year. So I'm definitely continuing with that into 2026. Other than that, I've got no real big plans to change anything on the allotment. I feel like we've got enough beds. Some of the beds do need a bit of repair, but I feel we've got enough beds. I do want to build a new compost bin, but that's going in the next few weeks. But overall, I feel that the allotment is quite happy as it is. One of the big things I would like to do, however, is glaze the greenhouse, but I've been going on for that since I put the greenhouse in. Who knows, perhaps next year will be the year. Now, I'd love to know, what plans have you got in place so far for 2026? Are you planning to change anything? Are you planning to try a certain style of gardening? If that's the case, then please do let me know. You can contact me via email, richard@veggrowerpodcast.co.uk. You can head to my website, theveggrowerpodcast.co.uk, where you can leave a comment on the bottom of the blog post, or you could leave a voicemail. Now, added to that, we also have a Facebook group if you do want to chat with some like-minded people. Now, of course, if you enjoyed this podcast, then please leave a rate and review. We've got none to talk about over this last week, so don't have to touch on that. And of course, the Supporters Club, as mentioned earlier on. And also, don't forget to follow me on social media. Well, that is the end of this podcast, so until next time, please take care.